what I want you to look at on the map is how widespread the Roman Empire was, and because it was so widespread, the Jewish community, the Jewish world was also widespread. If you look all the way to the left on your map, you can see that there were Jewish communities, nice-sized Jewish communities in Spain, and we're talking about just about the beginning of the new millennia. Okay, the maps are outside, so, and also all the way over to, we talk about Parasu Madai. Well, Madai is Media, and Media has Jews, and so on. So it's just something to look at. We're not really going to be discussing it today. It really went a little bit more with last week's lecture, but I wanted you to have it. Okay, last week, we set the stage for our mission this year. And our mission is to examine the survival and the achievements of Jews in a world that became increasingly hostile as Christianity became the dominant religion in Europe. We began by looking at the Jewish people after the destruction of the First Temple, and then we turned our attention to factors within the Roman Empire which made it fertile territory for the introduction of a new religion. All the conquered lands of the empire were unified by means of excellent roads. There were, for the most part, uniform laws for all the provinces. People shared a common language. We also noted the weakening of paganism. Paganism, which had been in effect for centuries, was beginning to get less popular. People were beginning to question. People were, we talk about how Abraham really told his father, after he broke all the idols, he told them, how could this piece of ceramic be a god? Well, we have the same thing that's beginning to happen in the pagan world around the beginning of the millennia. But people were searching, and they really couldn't find what they were looking for. They could not relate to an abstract philosophical doctrine that was very lofty. And today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the abstract doctrines, but what people wanted was something that they could relate to, something that they could touch, something that they could feel. They still yearned for religious mysteries. They wanted a living God that fashions and creates and rewards and punishes, and who relieves from burdens, and most of all, one who dies and returns to life. Today, we're going to look at the intermingling of Judaism and Hellenism. Let me briefly define Hellenism and tell you that it is a devotion or imitation of ancient Greek thoughts, customs, and styles. After the death in 44 of the Common Era, what we are doing is we're going to see that a lot of the people that we're talking about begin before the Common Era and live into the Common Era. But after the death in 44 of the Common Era of Herod Agrippa, who was the grandson of Herod the Great, the Romans began to inflict new persecutions upon the Jews. And these persecutions play a very important role. It was an unsafe political situation, and along with the economic challenges it generated, led to many Jews becoming Hellenized. Think, if you will, to put it in perspective, to the Americanization, if you will, of the Jewish world, because it's going to be very important in our discussions. For the most part, as Jews began to adopt a lot of Hellenism, a lot of Greek customs and traditions, for the most part, they stayed religious at first. There were signs of assimilation, but most of those signs of assimilation were changes of names, changes of languages, and most of those changes did not really change the spirit of Judaism, even in the diaspora. And we are going to be making a difference and pointing out the very big differences between the Jews who lived in Eretz Israel, in Palestine, and those Jews who lived in the diaspora, who lived in all these areas that were not Palestine. And Palestine, then as now, we're talking about really a little bit of a country, a little bit of an area. But there's going to be a very big difference between how the Jews who actually lived in Eretz Israel responded to Hellenism and how those Jews who responded who lived in the diaspora. But we do have, and as time goes on, and again, think Americanization, if you will, and we have the changing of names in the beginning. So, and we all will discount that and say, okay, not such a big deal. So instead of being Chava, you're Eve. It's not such a major, it doesn't mean that I'm not keeping all the mitzvot, right? It just means that I want to get along better in society. And so I adopt a name that is a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more recognizable. So we know that in the beginning, for example, Matisyahu, Yehuda HaMaccabi, Shimon, there were no Greek names attached to them. They were who they were. But later on, we have John Hyrcanus. In other words, we have a Jewish name for somebody along with a Greek name. But more to the point, and more importantly, the Jews began to create an entire literature in the Greek language. There were inscriptions on the synagogues. We have evidence that there were minutes that were taken at the meetings of the synagogues. And remember, we spoke actually it's more than a few weeks ago. It's before I traveled and before I fell. But we spoke about the Anshe Knesset Hagadolah. So we had Jewish synagogues. And the Jewish synagogues took minutes. Hadassah will tell you that that's the only evidence that we have of what either did or didn't happen. But they were in Greek. And there were epitaphs on the tombstones that were also in Greek. And if you take a tour through either the Bible Lands Museum or the Israel Museum, you will see evidence of the epitaphs on the sarcophagi, and you will see that they are in Greek. And that tells us something. It tells us something about the movement away from pure, let's call it Yiddishkeit. All of these were indubitable signs of assimilation, deep enough to penetrate through the surface of things into the innermost religious and cultural life of the individual and the community. Even the great and powerful Jewish community in Babylonia, and we will see that the Babylonians were by and large, it's Bavel, that's where all of our Gedolim, where we will see that that's part of where the Mishnah comes from and the Talmud comes from, all of the things that are important to us 2,000 years later. But even in Babylonia, we have evidence that the Hellenization of the group was evident. It was there. Okay. Moreover, we also begin to see apostates, people who gave up the religion, people who, we would say in our language, shmatted themselves. And they became, many of them, treacherous and mean. They became the worst kind of anti-Semites. And that's a little bit true today as well. There is no question that there were many more of these fickle Jews, we might call them, in the diaspora than in Eretz Israel. These Jews, perhaps because of the influence of Greek philosophy, Perhaps they imitated the Gentiles among whom they lived. These Jews began to take a rather free attitude towards some of the stories that we read in the Torah, towards ceremonial laws. Ceremonial laws is a fancy term, if you will, for mitzvot. And they began to move. So in the beginning, we changed the names. We wrote certain proclamations in Greek. Many people who lived in the diaspora found it more useful to be able to speak to people who lived with them, to do business with them, okay? So many of them then began to question some of the stories, some of the mitzvot that had been taken for granted in earlier times. And we know that there were Jews who wanted to belong to both worlds. This, again, should sound very familiar. They wanted to be part of Greek culture, and they still wanted to be good Jews. And with the unceasing pressure of the influence of the Greeks, this movement away from what we would call pure Judaism began to take a more specific form, and it began to grow. We meet many Jews who endeavored to be both Jews and Greeks. There were Jews who felt they needed to apologize. After all, what's this business about marching around the streets with a tree and something that looks like a lemon? How do we explain that? How do we, right? And there were Jews, in order to glorify their nation and to prove the antiquity, found it necessary to create a whole forged literature, according to which venerable figures among the Greek poets recognize the importance of Judaism. You know, when you have an election, we very often invite, this has just happened in the last American election, you invite famous people, actors or actresses, to give a haskama, to give an approval of the candidates. Well, here we find that we ask important Greek scholars, and we have a whole bunch of evidence of this, but we invite important Greek scholars to prove to the lay people that Judaism is an important, real, traditional, goes back centuries religion. Jews like these, who lived in the diaspora, were generally not particularly sound in their faith. And we find that that continues to progress. We find that Jews, as time moves away, as they begin to get more and more Hellenized, they begin to be less and less what we would call observant or religion. In this way, the Jews of the diaspora were prepared for the first compromise between Judaism and Hellenism. And that would be offered by Aristobulus, the philosopher, and Philo, whom we're going to talk about. In like manner, we shall see that openings for Christianity were then made by a second compromise. And this compromise was made by what we might call thorough or true Judaism and a little bit of diluted Judaism. And by the way, just to mention it so that we're not going to get to it, maybe not even this year, it may take us a while, but when we begin to have the Reform movement in the 19th century, it follows exactly the same steps. The Reform movement follows exactly what I've just mentioned. First, we get the adoption of, in this case, mostly either Eastern Europe or German culture, and then we get trying to prove that this is what the Torah really meant, even if it didn't say that. We could use parables, we could use metaphors, we could use interpretations, and then, right, we begin to lessen the need for mitzvot and so on and so forth. So this is not something that is just applicable to this particular period. But this particular period is very important because it changes the entire lifestyle of the Jewish world. Christianity, whatever you want to say, Christianity is a major force throughout the Middle Ages. Stephen and Paul, whom we will meet next week, were Jews. They were Jews who lived in the Hellenistic diaspora. And they encountered violent opposition from the Jews. Even the synagogues of the foreign-speaking persecuted them and plotted. And eventually, they will kill Stephen. So, kill him because he was blasphemous, because they felt he wasn't a good enough Jew, that he was, call him an apikoros, if you will. He was. Okay, now, and yet, they found that they were having trouble. They could not, they didn't have the education, perhaps, they were afraid, all kinds of reasons. But they found that they were uprooted from the Jewish tradition, and they did not live, or perhaps could not live in the diaspora, a completely Jewish life surrounded by Torah and mitzvot. Therefore, it becomes easy for many of them, and we're talking now about the Hellenistic diaspora Jews. It becomes easy for many of them to disregard some, more, many, of the mitzvot, and the fact that we will see that Christianity will open its gates even to idolaters. This was not done without a long and bitter struggle. But if it had not been for the state of affairs in the diaspora, and if it had not been for these half-assimilated people, the struggle would not have ended with the complete victory of Saul. I call him Saul Paul, of Saul, till we call him Paul, but right now we're still calling him Saul Paul. Okay, what we are calling the intermingling of Judaism and Hellenism is revealed in 3 separate books in the works of a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher, and the works of the Hellenistic Jewish philosopher is Philo, and the 3 works we're not going to discuss, not necessary for our purposes. One was called The Wisdom of Solomon, which is permeated with the spirit of the Bible, but also is replete with Greek doctrines. And when we talk about Greek doctrines, we're talking about paganism. So yes, it's a Jewish book, written by a Jewish Hellenist, and yet purports to be Jewish, and yet really isn't. The 4th Maccabees, which, by the way, has nothing to do with the Maccabees in rebellion, and it was written as a sermon. Its goal was to prove that reason, which must be God-fearing reason, could triumph over all kinds of bodily torment. The book writes that the requirements of the Torah are much more important than any decrees of the king. But there are sections in the book that negate accepted principles of Judaism. And the 3rd book, the Sibylline Oracles, were rich in many books, was composed for the purpose of propaganda among the pagans. They reproved the Gentiles because they believed in the will of the pagans. They called upon the Gentiles to turn away from their own gods. But they also include a mixing of Judaism and Hellenism. And they anticipate what will eventually become the very essence of Christianity. Now let's look at Philo. Philo of Alexandria lived from, I could say, approximately 2015, some people say even 25 before the Common Era, to 45 or 50 or 40 in the Common Era. So approximately the turn of the millennium. He was a Hellenized Jew. He was also called Judaeus Philo. He lived in Alexandria. Alexandria had a population at that time of about 1 million people. It was the largest Jewish community outside of Eretz Israel. Important. He came from a wealthy and prominent family, and he appeared to be a leader in his community. He had a brother, Alexander, who was even more important than he was. He was a wealthy, prominent Roman official. And by the way, now and throughout the entire history of the Jews living in the diaspora, and I would say even including today, we have all kinds of Jews who are invited to be government officials because of their intellect, their experience, their education, their money. But this was true in Alexandria as well. Alexander, who lived in Alexandria, was a customs agent. He was responsible for collecting dues on all goods imported into Egypt. He donated money to plate the gates of the temple with gold and silver. Big Baal tzedakah. He also made a loan to Herod Agrippa I. Philo himself was also involved in the affairs of his community. This was true especially during the crisis relating to the pogrom, which was initiated in 38 of the Common Era by Flaccus during the reign of the Emperor Caligula. You've all heard of Caligula. Philo was elected to head the Jewish delegation, which was sent to Rome in 39 and 40 to see the emperor. Philo was thoroughly educated in Greek philosophy, which can be seen from his superb knowledge of classical literature. He had a deep reverence for Plato, and he referred to him as the most holy Plato. He actually will say at some point that Plato was up there with Moses, with Moshe Rabbeinu. Philo produced a synthesis of both Greek and Jewish philosophy. And in the process, although this was not his intention, in the process, he laid the foundations for the development of Christianity. His primary importance, as we look back, is in the development of a philosophical and theological basis for what eventually became Christianity, which, by the way, he was not involved in. This is not something that he did. We will find, by the way, that Christianity is generally invented after the fact. It's invention going back in history and looking. We have neither, as we'll see next week, Jesus, who was probably a pretty much good Jew, would have certainly been much more comfortable in a shul than in a church. But after he died, after he was crucified, by the Romans, by the way, after he was crucified, achrei mot kadoshim, he became holy. So the Jewish traditional was uninterested in the philosophical speculation and therefore did not preserve the thoughts of Philo. Yet he was clearly one of the most important and revered members of Alexandria's Jewish community. He is considered the outstanding example of a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher, this intermingling that we talked about. He wanted to be both. And we can only evaluate his ideas and see his ideas as a reflection of what people thought. Philo-Judaeus is the only Hellenistic Jewish philosopher and writer whose works we have whole. Ironically, they were not preserved by the Jewish community, because he didn't have anything to say to the Jewish community. They were preserved by the Christians. Many scholars feel he was actually more Greek than Jewish, and some scholars believe he didn't even know Hebrew. Others believed, just so that you don't take that as gospel, others believed that he was thoroughly versed in Jewish learning. Not surprisingly, his writings did not find acceptance within the Jewish world. But they did find a response among the early Christians, because the early Christians were looking to prove that there was a compromise between Judaism and paganism. When we say Hellenism, we remember that Greek thought was pagan. Yet what Philo actually intended was a compromise between Judaism and Hellenism, with emphasis on the Judaism. That's what he meant to do. That is not what his books did. His basic approach to understanding the Torah was based on allegory, symbols, metaphors, stories. His main access to the Torah was through the Greek translated version of the Torah called the Septuagint. Because the Greek world thought it unfair that only Jews had access to the Torah, Ptolemy sent ambassadors to the Kohen Gadol asking for scholars to come and translate the Torah. According to Philo, even God felt that it was a scandalous thing that the Torah should only be known to the Jews. The Jewish translators did their best. They were bound. They wanted to preserve the original text. They prayed to God that they would succeed. There were 72 of these translators in 72 different rooms. And they managed, with Ruach HaKodesh or whatever, to be able to write the same exact translations. Every word and every phrase was written and translated with no individual variation. Our rabbi, Rabbi Aryeh Stern, who was the former chief Ashkenazi Rav of Yerushalayim, in a Devar Torah, that this even referred to the phrase, Vayichalu Elokim Bayom HaShvi'i Malachto Asher Asah. And this was translated by all 72 translators as that God rested on the sixth day, rather than Yom HaShvi'i, which would mean the seventh day. But he explained that all 72 translators understood that it would have been too philosophically confusing to speak of ceasing work on the seventh day when our understanding is that God created the world in 6 days. So even so, that there is, with the fact that this was all translated, it was a translation that everybody agreed upon, there is no question that some of our Gedolim view the translation as unfortunate. In Masechet Sofrim, Perek Aleph Halacha Zayin, it is argued that the Torah can never be precisely translated. And by the way, those of us who have ever had the opportunity to read a book, any book, in the original, are aware of the fact that the translation always leaves something to be desired. And so, these Gedolim felt that the Torah translated into Greek was at least a perversion on some levels. Now, Philo never said that one should abandon the Torah, that one should not do mitzvot. Rather, he argued for something more subtle. He personally observed halacha, even as he understood each mitzvah through a lens of either allegory or metaphor or whatever. He was rooted enough in Torah to practice, and he did not want to change the practice of mitzvot. It kind of reminds me of a Reform rabbi colleague I had when I was working in the States. And he explained to me that he put on tefillin every day. And I said to him, why? You don't believe in it. Your religion, your sect, not a sect really, but okay. Your interpretation, the Reform interpretation, just says that you don't have to put on tefillin, that it's not necessary, it's not a requirement. So why do you do it? And he very clearly explained to me, yes, but he's the rabbi, and he has to be an example. So Philo kept the halachot. He kept the mitzvot. He did some interesting interpretations as to why he was keeping this or that mitzvah. However, he kept them. Now, he saw the translation of the Torah as a fulfillment of the Jewish ideal of universalism. He saw Hellenism as valid together with the Torah. He believed that Judaism was a paradigmatic example of how to live a life with what he called engaged Hellenism, that Hellenism would engage together with the Torah. The outside world stands to benefit from the Jewish tradition as much as Jews should use Greek culture to grow within an understanding of Torah. As we've mentioned, Philo was at the central hub of the Hellenistic Middle East. He was steeped in Greek writing. It seems that his major objective in his interpretation of the Torah was to argue for this synthesis, what we called before intermingling of Torah and Greek philosophy. Moreover, he viewed the Torah as the most outstanding example of Greek philosophy. He suggested that Jews who read the Torah should be interested in Greek philosophy, since it helps to actually uncover what the Torah really had in mind. Let us look at some of his basic ideas. For him, for Philo, God is perfect. But this perfect and infinite and not in any sense corporeal God, if God is perfect, he asked, how could he create a world that is troubled, that is imperfect, that is transitory, that is perishable? And by the way, these are questions that have plagued our rabbanim, our scholars throughout history. There are debates all through Jewish life and Jewish writings that deal with these very same questions. How could God, who is absolutely good and perfect, form a world that contains evil, the essence of imperfection? It is important to understand throughout all this that Philo's monotheism, his belief in one God, was not a theoretical principle. He really believed it. It was a principle in his life. About creation, he taught that since God is absolutely perfect and good, he could not have created ex nihilo, yesh me'ayin, the world which is imperfect and has evil in it. So how do we, in the 21st century, go about evaluating Philo? There is no question that his ethical teachings were decidedly Jewish. He suggests that the goal of morality is to be freed from the senses. Remember, we spoke about Epicureanism and that it was the senses that guided what was good and what was bad for you. He identifies 4 cardinal virtues: wisdom, self-control, courage, and justice. For a man to be free from the strong power of the senses, he must have the help of God. Nothing wrong with that statement. Only God has planted morality in man, and it is the grace of God which gives man the power to be moral. This view is the basis that will later become what the Christians call doctrine of grace. But Philo bases his conclusions, remember, there was no Christianity yet in his world, but he bases his conclusion on the Torah. He believed that Bnei Israel is a chosen people, that this deep nationalism is enclosed in a high and exalted universalism. He believed in the love of one's enemy, which Christians boast later that was something that came from Jesus. Not so. Philo finds it in the Torah. He quotes the Golden Rule. He valued humanitarianism, the value of man. No man is a slave by nature. The whole ethical teaching of Philo is expressed with utmost clarity in this short sentence, and I quote. Actually, I quote a translation, but okay. Do any of you speak Greek? Well, I don't. Okay. Among the vast number of particular truths and principles found in the Torah, there stands out, so to speak, high above the others, 2 main heads. One is a duty to God, as shown by piety and holiness. One is a duty to men, as shown by the love of mankind and justice. Nothing that anybody could argue with. As for Philo's view of the Mashiach, we need to recall, first and foremost, that the Mashiach of the year 0, or even 100, was not the Mashiach that we talk about today. The Mashiach was not then only a spiritual leader who possessed spiritual attributes and ethical qualities, but was also somebody who fights and conquers, in his day particularly the Romans. And by the way, we have that true when we talk about Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba was viewed by many as a Mashiach, was he not? And he was certainly not a spiritual leader. He was a warrior. And this certainly is not the Christian Messiah, because the Christian Messiah is not at all like a man who leads his group into war and subdues great and populous nations. So we will see, when we talk about Christianity, we will see that Christianity takes a little bit from Philo, Christianity takes a little bit from Hellenistic people, Hellenistic theory, Hellenistic ideology, and so on. In general, Philo himself was thoroughly Jewish. In his writings, there are many things that are very, very similar to what we will find later in the Midrash and in the Talmud, but he takes pride in being a Jew. He makes the Greek philosophical system subservient to Judaism. In other words, if you were to have asked him while he was living, what is more important, the Torah or the Greek writings, he would have answered without hesitation, the Torah. He preaches the observance of the mitzvot. He is absolutely opposed to what he called those intellectuals among the Jews of Alexandria who satisfied themselves merely with allegorical interpretation or with exalted ethical meaning. In other words, you got to do it. You got to perform the mitzvot. This is what Philo taught. He expected a completely human Messiah who would conquer and rule over various lands and peoples, and yet was at the same time endowed with great spiritual, intellectual, and moral attributes. In spite of this, Judaism, we do not accept him. And there can only be one explanation. Judaism rejected Philo, and Christianity drew nearer to Philo precisely because of the compromise which Philo made between Judaism and Hellenism. He was immersed in Greek culture, so much so that he considered Jews who do not speak Greek to be barbarians. And certainly he attempted to bring about a compromise between Judaism and Hellenism. The wise men of Israel and the wise men of Greece, he argued, both had the same purpose. In fact, he said Moses and Plato often said exactly the same thing. And between the Holy Scriptures, the Torah, and the best of the Greek philosophical writings, he saw no contradiction. Whatever appears in them to be mutually opposed is to be interpreted, quote, according to the understanding. That means we should use a mashal, we should use a metaphor, we should use allegory, we should do something that can take what is different in Greek writing and in the Torah so that we can make them merge and actually say the same kind of thing. But understandably, Judaism feared compromise. Judaism claimed and taught and believed that its truth was unique in the world, that its Torah was absolutely without parallel, and that its ethics could not be equaled in any other nation. And here Philo comes along and he says, there's also truth, equal truth, in the books of the pagans, and their philosophers, and their saints, and their holy men. And that Greek morality is very lofty and comparable in its basic principles to Jewish morality. Now, the instinct of self-preservation of the Jewish nation and of the Jewish religion, which are indeed one and the same things, whispered to Orthodox, and I'm just using that term the way we would use it today, Judaism, that it must not admit this compromising doctrine into its house. And again, we will see exactly the same thing in the 19th century when the Reform movement begins to take root. They will quote from the Torah, and they will suggest minor little compromises. And the rabbis of the time said, oh no, this doesn't go. There was a great and deep-seated fear that if there would be a cessation of the opposition between Judaism and Hellenism, there would be a cessation of the recognition of the uniqueness and peculiarity of the Torah of Israel. And the Jews would cease to exist as a nation, and Judaism would cease to exist as a religion. Now let's look ahead. And in very truth, Hellenistic Judaism, which did not sense this danger, did pass away and did cease to exist in the world. On the other hand, Palestinian and Babylonian Judaism, which did sense it, rejected the Philonic compromise and have survived under the most difficult conditions to this very day. On the other hand, Christianity, now again, the Jews are not accepting Philo now, the beginning of the first century. The Christians accept Philo later, because we don't have any Christians now in the first century. As we shall see, Christianity set aside the mitzvot, made the Messiah a deity, removed from its teaching Jewish national separatists, sounds so much like the Reform movement, and all the territorial and nationalistic aspirations contained in the Jewish messianic conception. The very same reason which caused Judaism to reject Philo and his compromise caused Christianity to accept him and his teaching, albeit for the most part in an emasculated form. This compromise between Judaism and Hellenism, between Israel and the pagans, is the foundation and basis for all of Christianity. If it had not been for this compromise, the Gentiles would not have accepted what really was, at least in its very initial stages, a Jewish doctrine at all. Philo pointed the way to this compromise, although he certainly did not intend the result which followed. Philo wished to bring the Gentiles into Judaism as proselytes, but Philo was not willing to yield to any sort of reduction of the requirements, meaning what you have to do in order to become a Ger Tzedek. On the other hand, we will see that Paul did yield to the Gentiles on every requirement of the law. There is no doubt that the teachings of Paul would have aroused strong opposition on the part of Philo if he had actually encountered it. But he came later. Paul came well after Philo. Secondly, Philo would not have agreed to any half-pagan additions to a purely monotheistic Judaism. And we will see that there will be some Pauline, from Paul, additions that Paul made in his time, and Christianity kept introducing more and more as the years went on. For in order to endear this mutilated and perverted Judaism to the pagans, Christianity introduced into it any number of Greco-pagan elements. Nevertheless, Christianity borrowed much from Philo. It borrowed the idea of a mediator between this crude and materialistic world and the abstract deity, remote and hidden from mankind. And we will see, by the way, as we move through the centuries, that this mediator, we will call him a priest. We will call him the greatest mediator will be the Pope. There's always somebody between you, the person, and God above. We don't have that in Judaism. You might go to a rabbi and ask a question, but we don't have a mediator. We don't have somebody that stands between the individual and God. You had a question?
How did Philo bring in the idea of a mediator?
He felt that there has to be remote and hidden, there has to be the abstract deity, and there has to be somebody, he called him the Messiah, somebody who acts between the people and God. And this Christian Messiah is a heavenly being, the essence of deity in his real nature, and a man only according to how he is revealed. Christianity also borrowed the ideal of biblical allegory from Philo. Philo had advocated allegory as one possibility of understanding Torah, however, or mitigating between what the Hellenists wrote, right? What the pagan philosophy was and where there were differences between it and Judaism. The Christians took metaphorical interpretation of Scripture and made use of it for two main purposes. It allowed them to accept the Old Testament and to apply some of its words to their leaders, notably Jesus. As a matter of fact, apart from the Old Testament, the New Testament had nothing to offer, nothing to support it. And by the way, we see the same thing again with the Reform movement. All the doctrines in the 19th century that the Reform philosophers used to justify whatever they were doing came from citations from the Torah and from the Talmud and from the Mishnah. All of their writings sound very familiar. And secondly, they were able, by means of allegory, to evade the obligatory character of the ritual requirements. And then they began to preach that there was no need to observe them, since the important thing is the intent, not the actual observance. It's important what is in your heart. It is important what you mean to do, not what you actually do. Not for nothing did the Christian church preserve Philo's writings and even interpolate them in numerous places, while Judaism neglected or forgot his existence and hardly mentioned his name until the time of Azariah min Adumim, the author of Meor Einayim in the 16th century, 1,600 years later. But in general, it was a very compromise between Judaism and Hellenism that, as embodied in all the works of Philo, which it gave occasion and impetus to the rise of a doctrine. This doctrine was Judaism and Hellenism at one and the same time. Yet in a certain sense, it was neither Judaism nor Hellenism, but a new kind of doctrine that was compounded of the two and more correctly contained certain elements of the two. The discussions and debates over conversion is an example. The main point of this compromise was, in this controversy, can you demand strict observance to the law of circumcision of pagans who accepted Judaism or would accept Judaism, or whether baptism, mikvah, was enough? And eventually, this kind of a compromise, where you go with the easier rule, the easier way of doing things, would be extended to all of the rest of the ritual requirements of the mitzvot and the Torah. In addition to the groups we've already encountered, there were people who were referred to as God-fearers, worshipers of God, or in an abbreviated form, the devout. These were groups that we could place somewhere in the middle. They were people who accepted Judaism as a great and beautiful ideal, who observed part of its customs, but who never became complete Jews. Many of the Gentiles in the days of the Second Temple, and for a certain time thereafter, were in relatively the same position. In a formal way, they remained what they were, generally pagans. But they had some respect for monotheism. Remember, we spoke last week about the fact that they were unhappy with pagan ideology. But they had some respect for monotheism and the Torah of Israel, and admired a lot of the beautiful Jewish customs. For example, the lighting of the Sabbath candles, the Sabbath rest, the prudence with regard to the eating of blood, the abstention from marriage with a sister, and the list goes on, but those are enough examples. They were drawing near to Judaism. They visited the synagogues, they read the scriptures in Greek translation, and they observed various regulations which were not too difficult. Although they were not complete Jews, they had departed from the ordinary pagan way of life. We will see that later it will be easy to gather this group in the middle, to a mystery religion that was close to the hearts of the seekers of God. First, because there was in it a certain similarity to the pagan mystery religions. Second, because Christianity was a religion of salvation, something about they were deeply concerned in those days. And they approached in principle the religio-ethical views of Israel without really accepting all the requirements. They were beloved by Israel because they were among those near the way of truth. And Israel was beloved of them because in its faith and its Torah, they found good, solid, elemental principles which they did not find in the pagan faith. And yet, as God-fearers and even the true proselytes, they did not always remain loyal to the people of Israel. Many could not stand the test in the hour of persecution. Remember, we have to keep putting this back in context. And by the way, that will be true throughout the Middle Ages. That will be true when we talk about the Spanish, and that will be true when we talk about the Germans, and that will be true when we talk about the Russians, that the persecution was often very hard to bear. And if you could get out of the persecution by conversion, very often that's what you did. Others did not have the strength to shake off paganism completely. And we can understand that, even if we go back to the Torah, right? And we have people that have Rachel Imenu, who have truth, right? For fertility and so on. And to take upon themselves the yoke of the Torah and the ceremonial laws, especially circumcision, was asking an awful lot of it. Only the abstractly religious and ethical conceptions of Judaism found favor in their eyes, not the whole package. Because we know Judaism really unfolds the true observer in every step from the cradle to the grave. It is no wonder then that when a man like Paul came and nullified in their presence the ritual laws and was satisfied with baptism alone without circumcision and gave them a faith in one God along with some mystery and mystical conceptions that he took from paganism, this new half-Jewish, half-pagan faith was taken to the pagan heart, which was covered by only a light wrapping of abstract Judaism, even before the coming of Paul. Okay, next week we're gonna move on, and we're gonna talk about the beginnings of Christianity. I do want to say that I'm not going to spend time on the intricacies of the development of Christianity. Our goal is to develop it, to get it in place. It's going to take centuries for Christianity to develop and for Christianity to become a religion that is important. It will not become important really to the 4th century, 330 or something. So we will try to do it that way. I have one more important announcement. If you did not receive a text from me, an email from me, reminding you that we were back in business, please write down on one of your pieces of paper, dhpolster@gmail, and send me a text, because some of your emails that you wrote down have been bouncing back over and overs. Hanukkah, I have yours. Don't worry. But if you write down D.H. Polster and send me an email, dhpolster@gmail, and send me an email, then I will for sure have a correct email from you and I can add you correctly to my list. Okay? Yes?
I guess he was not too familiar with the Talmud, or at least the later part of the Talmud.
Talmud wasn't written yet.
Yeah, well, the Mishnah, the maybe.
The Mishnah wasn't written yet either. Right? He dies in 40 or 50 or 45 in the Common Era, and we don't get the Mishnah to about 200 and the Talmud to 400 or 500. We're going to talk about that, by the way, because that's important in terms of how we exist in the Middle Ages and what we do. So in a couple weeks, we'll establish Christianity and then we'll move on. Yes?
Two questions. Why did the Romans oppress the Christians? And did they also oppress the Jews at the same time?
Well, first of all, they oppressed the Jews first. I told you we don't have any Christians yet. I talk about some things that Christianity will take from Philo or will take from this compromise between Hellenism and Judaism. Okay, that's true. However, we don't have a Christian religion yet. Okay? Bear with me.